me? Testing. You can hear me? Okay. I speak loud, so. And we're gonna be starting in a couple minutes, but does anyone need a whisper translation from English to French? No? Anyways, I speak French. If you have questions in French, ça me dérange pas. Je vais le faire en anglais. I'm gonna do it in English because it's a better flow, but please, if you have a question or anything, feel free to speak in French. Okay, so I guess we'll start. So my name's Jessica Quijano. I have been a frontline worker for 20 years, working a lot in harm reduction. I've worked for a variety of different organizations in Montreal, Cactus, Réseau. I was a street outreach worker with a sex work program for men and trans sex workers. And then most recently, I've been working at the Native Women's Shelter on a project called the Ishku Project, which is a project to eradicate the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, trans and two-spirit folks in Montreal. And what our project was that I work directly with the police when an Indigenous woman goes missing or is murdered and file missing persons report and put pressure on police to actually locate women, support families in whatever they need, whether it is culturally with support. And I'm mentioning all this because I'm going to be talking about the importance of decriminalization of drugs. I make those links with MMIWG2S, that sometimes people don't make those links. How drugs, sex work, the criminalization of sex work and drugs contributes to this crisis that we're currently in that is not ending, of Indigenous women going missing and being murdered. So before I start, I'd like to have more of a discussion, and I'd like to say that I do not have the answers to these very, very complex issues that we face in society, and I hope that we can expand and think about that and raise a different consciousness, because I think sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions of what harm reduction means and what drug decriminalization means and what that would look like in a society where we would no longer criminalize drug use, drug possession, and selling drugs. So, I mean, if someone wants to jump in, what is harm reduction to you? And if you don't want to, it's fine. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. So harm reduction was something that was used in addiction, where, as you might know, places like Insight in Vancouver, to deal with the overdose crisis that we're currently in a where it was that we were, and actually the first needle exchange was actually here in Montreal at Cactus. They were the first needle exchange to be in North America, where during the AIDS crisis in the 80s, there were many people that were dying of AIDS, and a lot of HIV transmission was happening among drug users that were using intravenously. Hepatitis C was being transmitted. So I'll just give you a little history. There was some badass nurses in the 80s that saw that they were seeing a lot of drug users that were with HIV, and then they decided to do this little small voluntarily and just started doing the whole, you bring in your needle, we'll give you a clean needle. And so it's obviously that's not what's done anymore. Now people just give needles, and now we have an actual safe injection site downtown after many, many years of activism and pushing government. So that's one thing about harm reduction, is really when someone is using drugs, is not to push this model of sobriety or telling them to stop using, is to really meet people where they're at. And so when I say meeting people where they're at, we can use that in a variety of different contexts of social problems. So I work often with couples that are in intimate violent relationships, intimate partner violent relationships. And it's the same kind of thing when I have, because I work more with women, when she contacts me and she might have been assaulted or might be in the hospital and so forth. My way is to find ways that communicate ways with her that we can make it safer for her, and not necessarily, again, just like not telling someone who uses drugs to stop using. I would never say to someone to leave a partner, because these are very, very complicated issues. when we talk about addiction, intimate partner violence, we're talking about trauma, deep-rooted trauma, and also when we talk about communities like Indigenous and Black communities who have suffered ongoing colonization and intergenerational trauma, it's really about trying to find ways to make it safer. So it would be for example, I have like my phone when a woman is maybe I work with a lot of sex workers, Indigenous sex workers that do sex work on the street. I've also worked with women who have been exploited, who have suffered sexual exploitation. I've worked with women who have been trafficked. So it's that they can contact me and I will, let's say, send an Uber to their house to pick them up, or I'll find creative ways to be able to, what will be safer right now, right? So when we talk about decriminalization of drugs, it's so important when we talk about defunding the police, because the majority of police repression is really because of people who use drugs. Especially, and it really depends what class you are when you use drugs. Because if you look at it, all classes use drugs. Whether you're rich or whether you're on some people on the street, the difference is that it's a lot more visible for when you're, let's say I work a lot in the Cabot Square area with a lot of Inuit women. So if it's visible and you're in poverty, that's where you will experience criminalization. And it's really important that, we have laws around sex work where people think it's decriminalized, but it actually isn't. It's decriminalized for women, but not for the people that they're selling services to, such as their clients, but also third parties. So the chauffeurs are criminalized. So-called what we call pimps, which I don't like to use, are criminalized. And so what that makes is that it invites police into their lives. And I would further say, often when you are living on the street, you might be not only just doing sex work, you might be selling drugs, you might be using drugs, you might do a variety of different hustles to get by. So the idea of just decriminalizing one aspect doesn't work with sex work. And just decriminalizing like they've been doing in BC, just possession is really, really not going to stop the opioid crisis and people from dying. It's not going to stop the constant criminalization of Black and Indigenous people. Right now we have a population of less than 5% of Indigenous people across Canada, and 3% are Indigenous women, but they represent, in some parts, 40% of our prison system. It's pretty similar to the U.S., and it's kind of outrageous if you think about it. We even have parts of even in Mi'kmaq communities in the east where 80% of the prison population are men, are Indigenous men. So, and then what it's really important, I think that oftentimes, if we want to support defunding the police, we really need to support sometimes people who do a lot of harm in communities, such as maybe selling drugs, maybe getting into violent situations. When we look at the shootings, they're often related to the drug trade. So sometimes people will be, I support defund, but I'm not going to support this person who might be selling crack on the corner of the street. That can really make us question a lot of our values and morality. And we've been really conditioned as a society to hate people who use drugs on the street. That is visible. So yes. So when I talk about MMIW G2S, the women that I see that go missing and are murdered, the majority of them are street involved, might be using drugs, might be selling drugs. So in the end, by decriminalizing drugs, we will really be able to, first of all, deal with drug use as not a criminal issue, but more of a human rights issue, and really get to the root causes of why people use drugs. And I do not want to say that drugs are sometimes there's this idea where drugs are great, drugs are this, and there's different kinds of drugs, right? And it's how drugs are used, because drugs not only, people have this idea that it's because of fentanyl that people are overdosing. Actually, no, there is, but there's a lot of people using drugs because they're using a lot of drugs and they die. And this happens all the time. When we really want to get down to the surface of it, people's relationship to drugs is very different in different contexts. Sometimes when I would hear and this is something that's Indigenous people, when they use drugs, it's so fucked up. Like they get so fucked up on the street. It's like not like other people who use or drink and use drugs. This is something I've heard among people on the street. And I think what is really being said is that the trauma being demonstrated is really intense, right? That trauma comes out when people are dealing with a lot of pain, a lot of very complex issues of when we're talking about hundreds of years of colonization, of depriving people of their human rights, of the residential school system, of the 60s scoop, and continuously now of the child welfare system that continues to apprehend children at a larger rate now than there was during the residential school system. So I think that that's where this is what Defund is about. It's about really finding solutions and get down to the core of why people might be using drugs and might be medicating themselves. And then we need to think about like a lot of the, there's pharmaceutical drugs that are like, for example, if you took crystal meth and Adderall, they're basically the same drug, except Adderall is done by pharmacists, pharmaceutical industry, and is safer than crystal meth when we don't know what junk is in it, right? Because right now, people during the pandemic have been really, really struggling financially. So what ends up when we have people struggling financially is that they will cut their drugs with different things to be able to make it last longer and to be able to sell it. And then if you do have a drug problem like on the street, like a lot of the women they like I work with, they probably need to make sometimes between $300 to $500 a day just to support their drug use, just to support this, because it's a constant cycle. And then when we don't offer alternatives to people like housing, or like culturally safe spaces for detox, like harm reduction needs to go with other. It's not just like we're here you go, here's your needle, use your drugs, let's go away. No, we need to go beyond that. Okay, what's next? Housing for that person, a holistic approach. Detoxes, yes, there's some people that really, really need a detox. They need spaces to detox. They need to get sober because otherwise they will die. In the past 2 years, since the pandemic, I've lost 14 women. Okay, that's been overdoses, suicide, homicide, drug dealers actually killing women because of drug debt. So there is a huge cost to the criminalization of drugs. People are dying. Any questions? Sorry, I kind of just go off. Is everything clear? Yeah, okay, all right, cool. So this is all to say, when we say let's decriminalize drugs, is that the reason why drugs are so profitable is because they're illegal. And it costs a lot of money and there's a lot of risk, right? When you're trafficking big amounts of money, like you're talking about like cocaine or, whatever from like South America or different parts. And then we saw with the legalization of marijuana, legalization did not solve a lot of the issues because the people that wanted to continue to sell drugs that might have a criminal record can't be part of the legalization in the market. However, how do you think all the SQDCs are getting their weed and all that? They're still getting it from the same people who have been doing this for like a very long time. So now it becomes like an issue where that's why when people ask why not legalization of drugs over decriminalization of drugs, we would say, and defund, but at least decriminalization, legalization can actually make it worse for people when they sell drugs, like legalization of marijuana. So technically you can be, if you don't have a license to sell weed and you're selling weed on the corner downtown, you could still get charged. So that doesn't solve the problem. Just like legalizing sex work doesn't solve the issue like we see in models like in Holland, where, if you, it really discriminates from the most marginalized of people who want to be in the sex trade. Like if you're like living with HIV, or if you have a drug use problem, like really the model is like more that New Zealand, which saw when they decriminalized sex work, first of all, a decrease in stigma. So a lot of times when we talk about decriminalization, things like drugs and sex work, I would compare it to when homosexuality was no longer criminal, right? It did not solve homophobia, right? But it's really important. So if we want people to actually talk openly about their drug use and not be afraid of the police and not be afraid of being like sometimes killed by the police, like we see a lot of drug busts and so forth, we need to create those spaces. And it comes from, first of all, from a policy level by decriminalizing all drugs. And that means, people who sell drugs, use drugs in any kind of way. And then it's to move beyond healing, to have some ways to heal. And that's not just like conventional, you got to go to detox, you got to go do whatever, 6 months and so forth. That could look very different for very many people. That could be investing in art. It could be investing in, like I think sometimes people need to move away to get out of the context of where they're living. It's to support people in however they want in order to deal with the trauma and that they're no longer hurting themselves, because drug use does hurt families and communities. So I just want to emphasize that. And if we want to really end the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans and two-spirits folks, we need to decriminalize drugs, because those are the women going missing and murdered. They are the ones in and out of the prison system. Those are the people. So if you actually do care about MMIW G2S, it would be to support decriminalization of drugs. This is like a very, very important human rights issue that people don't always make those links. Any questions? Yes.
Would decriminalizing drugs improve so that would decriminalizing the drugs ensure that the drugs that are being sold are safer and
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about educating people. I'm very disappointed actually about how how the sale of weed does not actually tell people the actual effects of it. For example, and in a responsible way. For example, smoking weed before you're 25 can develop your brain. It's can have a negative effect. There are some people who go into full-on psychosis when they smoke marijuana. There's so many different ways it would be to educate people on what it does to your brain, right? But there's a Dr. Carl Hart, who's a well-known neuroscientist in the USA. So Dr. Hart, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's from Florida. He lived in the projects in Florida, and his goal was to find a cure for drug addiction. That's what it was. He was like, I'm going to become a doctor. My community is ridden with crack, and it's destroying. I'm going to find something that's going to make the brain be take something like a pill. Let's end the addiction. So through his research, what he found was really interesting. So he went in parts of New York and would work with people who are very much addicted to the substance he used was crack, and I can't say the word. You know what I mean? Uppers. So what it was someone. So this is the idea that people who use drugs, they always need to use drugs. They can't. They have no control. So what he did was that he gave people either crack or $5. And half the time they chose the money. Okay? And what he also realized is that drugs actually they do have effects in the brain, but the more negative effects is the stigma, the criminalization of people who use drugs. The fear of not being able to talk about it. That's what really weighs very heavily on people. So this idea that when you use that, actually, so people who use, and this I see all the time on the street, people don't necessarily, they want to eat and so forth. And then there was he did the whole, I don't know if you heard of the rat experiment, when they put rats in with, and I'm not going to say this is the same as humans, but it's an interesting, that they researched, they put rats in a cage and they gave them cocaine. So the rats got they were just doing cocaine all the time. They were just going after the cocaine. But then they put rats with things to do, and they didn't really use the cocaine. Okay, so that's just to say that I'm not saying that that's the same as human beings, that when we provide support, people have a good quality of life, they can pay their bills, they're able to talk to people, and I've seen this through my work, their drug use goes down. Actually, I've worked with people that have been on the street for 20 years. I've known people who've been on the street since they're 20 years old. And I've seen them on the street now. And I've actually seen them as we were being able to get them into some programs like social housing. Well, housing is the biggest key. Once we were able to get them, the drug use slowly went down. It really did. They never did necessarily any programs and so forth. And I always used to think, imagine if we would have got this person at 20 and actually got them all the support services instead of them slowly deteriorating and you know, maybe contracting HIV. Okay, you living with HIV. Now you get to go into that program.